What is up guys, Morton here from SteamFirst.com with a review for the Japanese role-playing game Hyperdimension Neptunia Re, Birth1, developed by Idea Factory and released January 28th, 2015 on Steam for $30. I realize JRPGs are kind of a niche genre. Some people love them and other people find them boring and tedious. Personally, I highly dislike JRPGs, which poses the question of why I'm reviewing one. Well, that's because Hyperdimension Neptunia Re, Birth1 is amazing. It's not flawless, of course, but it's still great. And now that I've given away my opinion in the beginning of the review instead of the end, let's back up and talk about why I hold this game in such high regard. Arguably, the most important part of any RPG game is the story you're supposed to be getting invested in. In Hyperdimension Neptunia Re, Birth1, which I'll just be calling Re, Birth1 for the rest of this review, has a pretty interesting story that goes fairly in-depth and has a large cast of characters. Sometimes the cast can be a little too big, with characters almost fighting for screen time, but each character is unique and fun. And before I get into talking about the actual story, it's worth noting the game breaks the fourth wall quite a bit. The main character, Neptune, will often mention being the main character, for example. The game takes place in a world called Gameindustri and features 4 different lands fighting for control. Each land has its own Console Patron Unit, or CPU, which is basically the ruler of the land. The lands are Planeptune, Lustation, Loe, and Leanbox, and as you can tell, they're all named after real-life video game consoles. The story starts as the 4 CPUs, also called goddesses, fight each other, and one gets knocked back into the world and wakes up with a nurse in training named Compa with no memory of her past. Her name is Neptune, and she's the weird, childlike main character. After she wakes up, she decides to go back to where she fell into the planet to look for clues about her past. Compa decides to go with her, and they begin their journey. They quickly run into another ally named IF and venture further into the dungeon. Once near the end, they find a disc that spawns monsters from it. After destroying it, they meet the main antagonist, R4. Her goal is, predictably, to take over Gameindustri, and of course our goal is to prevent that from happening. The story is kind of convoluted, but it's pretty good. It's way too crazy for me to accurately explain it, but that's the beginning anyway. You travel all around to the different lands, meeting up with a pretty large cast of characters, all of which are engaging and unique, and most of which will join your party to fight with you. The story is interesting and it's fun, and even though sometimes it can be kind of hard to follow, it's explained fairly well. Story gets a 4.5 out of 5. Gameplay wise, Rebirth1 is a lot better than most JRPGs I've played, but there are still some problems I have with it. For starters, it was originally a PlayStation 3 or PlayStation Vita game, and it can show in the controls. The keyboard and mouse controls are weird to say the least, and the hotkeys for different attacks take some getting used to. After about 20 hours in the game, I was still pressing the wrong buttons sometimes. Granted, I could have changed the hotkeys to something I liked, but I'm far too stubborn for that. Also, you can only save at certain points in dungeons, though you can save anywhere in the overworld. And if you die, you go all the way back to your last save, which means if you forgot to save after listening to 10 minutes of dialogue and then die in a dungeon, you'll have to go through all the dialogue again. Not that I would ever do that. But it's not terrible because it's pretty easy to skip through all the dialogue if you aren't interested in reading it for the 15th time. The combat also doesn't seem to be as deep as it thinks it is, either that or I was playing the game wrong, but it didn't seem to matter. The combat is turn-based, like all JRPGs. The enemies have their health bar and then a separate guard bar. Your attacks can either be Rush, which hit a lot of times for a small amount of damage, Break, which hits a few times and is mainly used to damage the enemy's guard, and then Power, which is the biggest damage dealer. The idea seemed to be, you use Break in order to get to the enemy's guard bar, and then you'll do more damage with your other attacks, but I basically just mashed my Power attack and made it through everything no problem. Also, Rush attacks fill up your EXE drive faster. The EXE drive is used for extra attacks at the end of your combo, which doesn't drain the meter, or a big flashy finishing type move that does drain the meter and also hits harder than anything else you'll have. The problem is that all attacks fill your EXE drive, so even though Rush attacks fill it faster, I still never bothered using them because they did no damage. I'm sure there's some type of awesome strategy you can use here with the 3 different attack types, but I couldn't be asked to figure it out and never needed to anyway. Most of the fights are against somewhere between 2 and 4 enemies, although boss fights only have 1 usually, and you have up to 3 people on your side. As I talked about earlier, Neptune, Compa, and IF are the first 3 characters you meet, so you'll fight with them in the beginning, but as the game goes on, many more characters will join your team, and you can sort which ones you want to be on the front line with and which ones you want to be partnered up. The partner system lets you swap out a character for another, so if one is injured or something, you can bring in their full HP partner. Also, characters that are partnered together can level up their Lily rank, which can unlock special moves that they can use together. The combat is of course turn-based, which is par for the course with JRPGs. Normally, I'm not too fond of turn-based combat, but it actually doesn't bother me in Rebirth1. Perhaps that's because there's other things going on, such as positioning your team so they can hit multiple enemies, or spreading them out so they can avoid area of effect spells, or perhaps it's because some of the special attacks look absolutely awesome, but I find the combat actually works well, requires some thought, but isn't overly complex. Another thing that isn't overly complex is the item system, which I like a lot. Instead of enemies randomly dropping items, and then constantly comparing them to each item everyone in your party is wearing, most of the items are bought at the shop and you can compare right there. In order to get better items in the shop, you need to craft the plan by using materials you get from the dungeon. For the most part this works well, but it's incredibly hard to figure out where specific materials come from unless you use a guide online, which I kind of dislike. The last couple things I want to talk about are probably my favorite parts of the gameplay, and the two things that make Rebirth 1 more enjoyable than other JRPGs to me. There's an overworld map, and you instantly travel to any dungeon or city you want to go to. For some people this may break the immersion, but I never found running around for hours very fun. The other thing is that there are no random encounters. If you're in a dungeon, every enemy is visible, and you can avoid them pretty easily if you want to. Doing this will set you behind a bit in levels, so I wouldn't recommend it, but it's great when you're going back through old dungeons for materials. Overall, gameplay gets a 4.5 out of 5. I thoroughly enjoyed playing Rebirth 1, and my few complaints are overshadowed by all the things I do like about it. I didn't mention it, but there's also very little to no grinding. You'll basically be strong enough for all the enemies when you get to them, and all the new members that join your party are right around the correct level for the area you're in, which is a huge plus in my book. The two parts of the game you can really tell had a tight budget are the graphics and the audio. Neither are awful, but my guess is they either ran out of money halfway through, or didn't have enough to begin with. Graphically, it isn't bad in the sense that there are glitches or that the characters look really weird or anything, but it's not super high quality, and the most noticeable thing are sprites being reused. Enemies seen in the first dungeon will be seen in almost every single dungeon with one slight tweak, like being a different color, and having a name that's almost identical. The only thing is, I honestly can't tell if this is a stylistic choice or a lack of time and money. For example, one type of enemy is different Tetris pieces, so each of the different Tetris blocks is a different enemy with a slightly different name. And Rebirth 1 has tons of references to real-life video games, so it makes sense, but it gets really confusing when enemies look almost identical and have names with only one letter difference. What I can say for sure isn't a stylistic choice is that some of the dungeons get reused. Not in the sense that you go back to the same dungeon multiple times, but in the sense that they literally just copy-pasted the dungeon, changed the enemies and items inside, and called it a new dungeon. The layout is identical, all the scenery is identical. In a way, it's kind of disappointing to go into what's supposed to be a big new dungeon and find it's exactly like one you cleared a couple of hours ago. That all being said, the art itself is pretty nice to look at. It isn't supposed to be a super realistic game, so the fact that it's not amazing quality doesn't actually hurt things that bad, and honestly, I think that the graphics, aside from the problems mentioned above, are actually quite good. All the main characters are unique and fit their respective lands nicely. Graphics get a 3.5 out of 5. Audio is good as well, but like I said, it does have some problems that I'll get into in a minute, but first the good things. The soundtrack is pleasant to listen to. Everything from the main menu to the battles and just the ambient noises are all very good. Things start to come apart when it gets to the voice acting, but not because it's bad. If you play in Japanese, you won't really have any problems. The Japanese voice actors do a good job and the subtitles are fine. The problem arises when you play with English audio. Only the important story scenes are voice acted. I don't have exact numbers, but I'd say at least 60% of the game has no voice acting in English. I imagine that's because it's expensive and they didn't want to pay for it, but things just kind of feel weird when one scene has voices but the next doesn't. It's a shame really, because the English voice actors do a good job and I do like their voices, but not having voices for so much of the game is really disappointing. The other slightly annoying thing about the voice acting is that every time you jump in a dungeon, they say something, but it's one of like 3 lines and it gets really old if you jump a lot. Now, there's not really a reason to ever jump, so it's not like that big of a deal, but I personally jump almost non-stop for some reason even though it started to annoy me. Luckily, you can swap out your main character to someone else and then listen to their jumping lines, so at least it can be a little varied. Overall, sound gets a 3.5 out of 5 for English and a 4.5 out of 5 for Japanese. Both are good, but having so much dialogue in English not voiced over is noticeable and disappointing. Replayability is really weird in Rebirth 1. There's 2 main things to do after you finish the game. The first is called the Coliseum. Basically, it's a plan you craft that unlocks a new area. The Coliseum is basically just a place you can go to grind levels. You select the fight you want out of a list of a rather large amount, and then you either win and gain an item and experience, or lose and get nothing. There are fights for all levels, so you can do it on any character, but it's just a grind, so it can get kind of boring, even though I do love the combat. The other thing to do after you complete the game is to begin New Game Plus, but it's kind of weird. You keep all your items, plans, character levels, etc., but the enemies don't get any harder, so you literally just one-shot everything because you're still fully geared and a high level, but everything else reset. It makes it feel kind of pointless for anything other than unlocking different items or seeing multiple endings. Which leads me to the last part, multiple endings. There are something like 8 different endings that you can get, but there's no real reason to play through the whole game for them again. Just save before the final boss fight on a different save file, and then meet the parameters for whatever ending you want and then finish the boss. then just reload that save, change your stats for a different ending, and do it again. This adds a little replay value, but not very much. Replayability here isn't bad, it's just unfortunately not great. The Coliseum is fun for a while, but you're gonna have to play a crazy amount to get to the final fights, like I'm talking probably hundreds of hours of just grinding out fights. Multiple endings is cool, and it will definitely take a while to get them all, but that's not really a whole new game, and there's no reason you couldn't just watch the ending cutscenes on YouTube or something. New Game Plus has potential to be great, but the fact that all the enemies just instantly die because they don't get any stronger makes it boring because there's no challenge at all. Replayability gets a 3 out of 5. It's alright and will keep you busy for a while, but the lack of a real New Game Plus is really disappointing. The only thing left to talk about real quick is the DLC. There's quite a bit, but it's all pretty cheap. For $1 each, you can get 3 new playable characters. You can also get new Coliseum battles, new plans for items, new quests, and increase the maximum level by 300. If you buy all the DLC, you'll get a pretty wide variety of things, although admittedly some of the items do make the game easier, and one of the DLC weapons makes it incredibly simple, so I don't recommend that. But the max level will be 999, and the Coliseum battles will be really hard if you get all the DLC. And it's pretty cheap, so it's definitely worth it. Overall, Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 1 is a very unique JRPG with a ton of strong elements and a handful of disappointing ones. It's a game that had the potential to be absolutely amazing if they had just done a couple things different, such as fully voicing the game in English and adding a real New Game Plus. Those things could have made a great game fantastic, but even so, it's still a great game. The combat is a lot of fun and intuitive, the story is engaging with interesting characters. Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 1 gets a 4.5 out of 5. For $30, you'll get at least 15 hours of gameplay, probably a lot more, and if you aren't sure about it, keep an eye out for sales. I've seen it as low as $8, which is a massive steal. Even if you don't like the genre, it's still well worth playing.